Maya Beiser, welcome to Beyond Stage Fright. Now, you're a cellist who has captivated audiences worldwide with your virtuosity, your eclectic repertoire, and your ongoing quest to redefine your instrument's boundaries. You've got both an adventurous and versatile career, marrying classical and rock together, and also reimagining the concert experience with the cello. You started off as a classical cellist. So what was it that inspired you to step into a musical world that is more diverse and has more diverse styles?
I was born into a very eclectic, multicultural environment. So, my parents never really, there was not a dogmatic kind of view of what art and music is. So I've always, was surrounded by a lot of different kinds of music. And as I grew and matured into the kind of artist that I am, I realized that for me, my artistry was about embracing music that was relevant to me, that is not just one kind of music, but rather, opening myself up to the world. And so that was one thing. The other thing is that for me, I've always wanted to experiment. I wanted to find new ways of creating music. And to be part of the creative process was very important for me. So not just to be an interpreter, not that being an interpreter is a lesser thing. I think it's an amazing thing, but I also wanted to be involved with the creation from the beginning. So I started to work with composers from different genres and really experimenting with what I can do with my medium, which happened to be the cello. When I was 16, I started to listen seriously to rock music, and actually to a lot of British rock, Brian Eno and Genesis and all these people. And I just became really fascinated by the kind of amazing depth and quality of what they were doing, and wanted to start exploring similar ideas on the cello. I also fell in love with Janis Joplin, which was just kind of, she was the second biggest inspiration for me, because the first one was actually Jacqueline Du Pré. When I was a little girl, I went to hear Jacqueline Du Pré, and my father took me to hear her play, and at that point, I as a little girl, I thought I want to be like her. And then when I heard Janis Joplin, I decided that I want to be the Janis Joplin of the cello, whatever that meant. I mean, I didn't think it in that terms, but I just thought I wanted to be able to bring that kind of quality of performance into the stage for me with the cello. This ability to completely let go, to completely just be absolutely fearless, and what she's been, but also charting new ground. And there was just something so revolutionary for me with the idea of what she has done, this sort of like a female rocker that just totally put her gut on the stage. But I think that the thing about rock music that is so appealing, and I think is so appealing, was really appealing to me, was that quality, that just where you kind of bring everything that you're about, and there are no barriers in a way. It's just, and I think that is the quality that we're looking for, from a performer. I mean, I think that's the thing that we connect to as audience, and vice versa.
You mentioned fearless. And that's a very interesting word, because we're talking about performance anxiety and performance stress, and you're talking about fearless. So does it make a big difference to you that you're, this stepping out into this really quite adventurous mixing of musical worlds, has that made a difference into lessening your own performance stress?
I think it made a difference in other kind of way. I specifically, I never had any fear of playing on stage. And what's interesting about that, Charlotte, is that it was only true when it's almost like there was this sense, and I seem to remember that, I was a very young girl, a very small girl, and quite frail, and didn't feel very secure in many other ways. But when I started to play the cello, one of the reasons that I was attracted to the cello was because it was big. And there was something about that I always felt like it protects me. And it's very interesting because I thought about it recently, about this whole phenomena of like, what, because I very much feel like the cello and me is one thing. And it's almost like the cello is an embodiment of who I am. But because I have this cello in front of me, there's just this thing that just helps me to become, to let go. The fearlessness of, I think there are two different things, or maybe eventually they kind of connect. But I think the idea of living life in a fearless way, which means, not being afraid to try new things, not being afraid to put yourself in the situations that you might fail, not being afraid to go to places that could be scary, and going there and seeing what happens and taking risks. I think my career has always been about that. It's always been about taking risks. When you commission new music, when you work with young composers, when you try different things, it's not a sure thing. You never know what's going to come out. But you always come out on the other hand. I always come out in the other end with something that surprises me and that takes me to a new place that I never thought I would get to. So it's more about, to me, it's more about sort of how I wanted to live my life and also how I wanted to be as an artist. Important questions, I think, that we don't think enough about, I think, as classical musicians. I think that often what happens is that the craft of playing, a complex piece of music, what it takes to actually put it all together is so complex and daunting that sometimes just getting that seems like, okay, we're there, and certainly we're not taught. We're not taught to think about all these other things. We're not taught to think about the process. There is that perfectionism that comes in our, and that's, in the classical training, and it's sort of like the expectations of which doesn't exist in any other form of music performance. This whole dogmatic idea of how a piece of music needs to be played, and the fact that it's so that we have all this, very clear idea. They just never really worked for me, So part of why I've expanded, I think, had to do with who I am as a person and what I wanted to be as an artist, but it also had to do with the things that I found constricting in the classical music world, and that I needed to find, my way around.
How do you feel when you play classical music, and how do you feel when you play classic rock or any of the other musical styles that you play?
I definitely feel more liberated playing music that was written for me, because when a music was written for me, I was there with the composer, and I don't have to, there's no guessing game. I don't have to go and say, oh wait, if I play this phrase this way, maybe it's wrong, maybe. And you know what's very interesting about this is that when you start working with composers who actually work for you, you realize how flexible these things really are, and how much a composer has an idea, but that doesn't mean that that's the only idea. It's like when Shakespeare wrote, the plays, I don't think he expected them to only be, performed in one way. There are many, many ways that you could play Shakespeare, right? That you can adapt it to what it means to you in that moment and make it relevant to your life. And what I always found very interesting is that people accepted that, always. People accept reinterpretation and restaging of an ancient play and make it something that, but when but if you take a classic, a piece of music, if you, and sort of reimagine it in your own way, you would be probably pretty badly criticized, right? Because we just sort of like, there's kind of one way that we expect it to be. And so the wonderful thing about all this other music that I play and working with composers and reimagining things is that I have the freedom to really interpret it the way that it feels right to me. And so yes, I'm very liberated. And I think being on stage is all about that. I think it's all about being liberated. You have to feel a sense of joy, and you have to feel a sense of power, I think. But the power is not from, oh, look at me. The power is from, I'm connecting to this, but this is something we can talk about later, but I'm connecting to this wonderful energy that's there, and I'm giving you everything that I'm about, but it's that ability, I think, that is the hardest thing, to get to, and it's the thing that then none of those stage fright and all that stuff is relevant when you're able to get to that point.
And on a sort of more mundane level, how would you prepare for a performance? How do you get ready for a performance on the day and also before that?
First of all, I'm a yoga practitioner. I do yoga and I meditate, and I think that every musician needs to do that. I really do. I think that you need to find that place where you can quiet your mind. And so I always meditate before I go on stage. And it's not like this ridiculous ceremony, but it's just those moments I breathe, first of all. And I learned, one of the most, to me, I think, I don't know if you know what pranayama breathing is, but it's, complete breath. I think that when you learn to do this kind of mindfulness thing, which is to quiet your mind, and sometimes, if it's a particularly nerve-wracking performance, meaning that, I don't know, it's taped live for a big, thing, and that in those moments, I feel like sometimes, even though I'm not often very nervous, but there are always some kind of nerves that are there, and I think for me it's just about just bringing things back to what it is. I have two things. One, I always dedicate the performance to someone, and so this is actually something that I've learned from yoga practice from early on when I started to practice yoga, and my teacher would teach me to you always dedicate your practice. And you can dedicate your practice to yourself, or you can dedicate it to someone. My mom died 10 years ago, so often I dedicated the performances to my mother. But sometimes if there's a person in the audience that I love, or that I would dedicate it. So I would think of one person, and I think that if you think of one person that you play for, it really helps, even if there are thousands of people there in the audience, because it kind of helps, because really you are playing for each and every one of these people. And so if you make that connection with this one person, whether that person is there in the audience or it's an imaginary person, and you play for them, to me that really helps a lot. It kind of it makes it very personal, which I think it is, and which I think it's you know, it's the thing that makes a performance really powerful, is when it's very personal.
And do you find that the yoga, the meditation, and your dedication to somebody, do all those things help your focus on stage as well?
Yes, the breathing and the yoga definitely helps. What it does is, I think what yoga does so wonderfully is it helps you. It's the practice. It helps you practice a physical, series of physical exercises while being mindful and while being able to float, which is kind of very similar to what we do as performers, because we're doing something that is physically quite demanding, obviously, and mentally very demanding, because we're connecting all these parts of our brain and our body. And you want to be able to do that while also float, and while also be in this kind of trance state, which is what I always hope that I get to, in every performance.
What would you say are your biggest stresses, and how do you manage them?
I never really worry so much about what people think, but it's always hard when you know that, oh gosh, this critic is going to be there and it's going to be in the newspaper the next day. And of course, you have absolutely no control about those things. So I think it's hard when you're kind of like in that very public stage and you know that you might be torn apart. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And it's part of, and especially with the kind of career that I have, because I take a lot of risks, and so that's always a hard thing. And I work on that. I work on I can't say, oh, just don't care, because not caring is not possible. But I do say, it's just about, okay, so you just, it's accepting the fact that you might get some rejections or that you might get criticism. And that's, I think, just goes with the territory of being in the public domain. Again, I think a lot of it is about focusing. It's about bringing yourself back to that place, which is, why am I doing this? What is this about? What really is meaningful to me? And just so, and then forgetting about all these other elements, and trying to, again, just play for someone you love.
How do you manage disasters on stage? I mean, probably not disasters to anybody else, but disasters that you might feel inside. How do you manage things going wrong?
It was actually the inaugural season of Zankel Hall, which is in Carnegie Hall. I played this big concert that was commissioned by Carnegie Hall, and it was all new music. It was a big multimedia event with a lot of complicated things, solo cello, but with a lot of media. And I started this big piece, and which has a lot of multi-tracks and a lot of things that happen on the computer. And the click track that I was supposed to lock with, which was locking me with the video and with everything, just did not start. There was a problem, and the sound engineer took him quite a while to realize that. And so there was this moment of, and by the way, that happened to me in many different, but there was this moment of this, okay, we're in the sold out concert hall, every important critic is there. It's like this really important thing. What am I going to do? And so, I started to play, there was no click track, and I just decided to keep going. And there was no way for me to actually tell the engineer that I was just, I just had to hope that eventually he would realize it. And so you get this panicky moment, and then you have to make that decision. And it's a little bit like, I think a soldier in a war or someone who is being, threatened, where you just have to rely on your instincts in that moment. And you would hope that everything you've done so far in your life, would bring you to that moment. So at that moment, I just said to myself, okay, this is what's happening, but I'm not going to stop. I'm just going to keep going and hope for the best. So that's the kind of fearless, where you just dive in and you say, okay, we're just going to go. And I did. And he did realize, shortly after that there was no, and he brought it back. And there was, as far as, obviously for me, that was a disaster, but nobody else knew, literally nobody else knew. And we moved, and I found my place. I mean, I sort of improvised. So that's the other thing. One of the things that I think is very helpful is to learn how to improvise, because I think that a lot of the stage fright that the classical musicians have comes from that. It comes from that rigidity and the fear of like, oh my God, what if I forget? What if something, But if you know that you can improvise, that you can just, make something happen until it comes back to, then it takes a lot of pressure out of you. And so that's what happened in that case. And not only that, nobody knew, but the composer didn't even realize. And then in retrospect, I thought, no, it's okay. It's okay, because it's okay to put myself in that place. And this, it's, again, all these things is about being able to allowing some vulnerability, allowing yourself, not being afraid of that vulnerability, and not thinking that everything always has to be perfect, that performance is about perfection, because it's really not. It's about being human. And that's the thing that's most beautiful about what we do, And so if we always think that everything has to be perfect, then also what separates us? So like why, and what is it? And so it's not. So I don't think this is what music is about. And I think that if you turn that around and you start thinking about this, it really helps with performance anxiety. I really do. I think a lot of it is that psychological, this fear of like, what would happen if I fail, right? What would happen? Here I am in front of all these people, and what am I going to do? And so it's like that fantasy of that horrific failure that takes you in that, right? So, but if you realize that it's that failure, or maybe that that the vulnerability is part of it, then maybe and that also if you realize that that even if something goes wrong, you're able to figure it out. And I think part of I think that there's also an element of just the experience that teaches you, of course. So when you've been on stage a lot, and when things happen, as they do, and you realize that you can navigate around them, and you realize that it wasn't the end of the world, and you realize that it was fine, and nobody really knew other than yourself, then you realize that it's okay. I think it's pretty much ingrained. It's definitely true for me, but I think it's pretty much ingrained in a lot of classical artists, or artists in general, is that we're very demanding of ourselves, and so this incredibly sense of high expectations, and like that everything needs to be, and like this very demanding part. That's the part, for me, I think that was the part that I needed to learn how to let go. And I needed to learn how to accept the imperfection, and now I'm not just accepting it, but I'm actually loving it. I'm actually embracing it as part of what this art is about, so.
What would you say is the feeling you have on stage when it's all going really well?
Well, for me, it's actually a feeling of trance. It's a feeling of it's this incredible energy, and I often try to describe it. It's like it's like you're surrounded. It's like you're connected to some higher power, and it's a religious experience. And I truly believe in that because I believe that there's this thing that happens in that moment where you connect with the music and you connect with the energy of the audience, and it all becomes one. And you feel it, and it's just like you're in it, and it's like this really wonderful, elevating experience. And it's the communication, it's the connection, it's this ability to sort of get out of yourself and with the music kind of speak, and so it's wonderful.
Maya Beiser, thank you very, very much. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you, Charlotte.